Hey guys, so at this point we're going to be removing the pot and soldering wires onto the board right here. If you already know how to solder and you're experienced with this kind of stuff, you can do it pretty much however works for you. If you have a little bit of soldering experience, you probably want to watch this. I'm going to try to do it the easiest way I know how to do it. I've tried it a couple of different ways and this seems to work the best for me. For one thing you need to think about though is this is where you're gonna hit the point of no return. Once you take this guy off, you're probably not ever gonna get it back on just right. I mean, it's possible, but not really realistic, I don't think. So this is where you gotta decide, am I gonna do this or am I not? And keep in mind, it is possible that you could ruin a transmitter. So you can desolder these. These guys helps. It's a solder sucker, like that. Because what you gotta do is heat up all three at the same time and get them, liquid, and then pop this out. These are often really kind of wedged in there, so even if there was no solder, you would have some resistance. And I've done it. Pulled it out nice and clean. A lot of times what happens is one of them will break off in there. So what I'm gonna do, because I know that I'm never gonna put this back on, is just cut them off with a flush cutter. And then I can either leave them in there or heat them up and pull them out one by one. It's just a whole lot easier. So I'm gonna do that now. One thing you need to keep in mind is one way you could easily ruin a board like this is these little copper pads are really, really delicate. If you're prying on them, they can peel off and then you're gonna have a hard time repairing that. So what you wanna do is try not to put a lot of torque. If you're gonna bend this up, try not to put a lot of torque on the board itself. I've got a nice little narrow tipped flush cutter, so I'll probably be able to just snap those off. In the past, I've always desoldered this, and that was kind of like the pain in the ass part of doing this whole thing. So I'm just going to do this because I'm not going to use that pot again. I'm not going to put it back on there. So. Voila. No pain in the ass that time. This comes right off. But we're going to solder to the other side. We're going to be soldering right here. It's pretty tight. As you can see, I popped this antenna connector off. These are really delicate little connectors, so when you're putting it back on, make sure you're putting it straight on and it gets snapped in there and locked, right? All right, so I struggled a little bit with that. As I feared, they're wedged in there pretty good, so it doesn't matter how much heat you put in it. It takes a lot of pressure to try to push them through. One I just pushed through, but the other two didn't seem like they wanted to come, but it won't matter because we're just making a tiny little solder connection there. So the wire that I've chosen might seem like an odd choice. It's 20 gauge. It seems way too big, but it's also silicone insulation, and this particular brand has very thick insulation and it takes the heat very well. One of the problems you'll have with doing these little joints here really close is when you go to heat it up to make the solder connection, if you have PVC or something that can't take the heat, it's all going to melt off, and then you're going to have a connection with these bare wires sticking out. You can fix that, but I find that it's just easier to use a little bit bigger wire and silicone insulation. And what we're going to do is to prep this, is take probably, I don't know, a little over half. Cut it off so that we just have a nice little thing here. And then we're gonna make it nice and neat, and I'm gonna bend it a certain way, and then I'm gonna tin it with a little extra solder. And then we're gonna tape it on there so that it's positioned so that it's actually pressing where we want it to go. That way, hopefully, when I heat the joint up and it flows, it all just goes together and I don't need to add any solder. That way I don't need a third hand or doing any crazy stuff. It should just all go together. It's all in the prep work of getting everything just right. And then you apply the heat and it just takes a second. If you do it right, it's super easy. If you're not prepped and you're doing it, you know, trying to put this there, then pick this up, and then it's just gonna be a nightmare. So take your time and figure out how you're gonna do this and prep it right. So I'm gonna trim this up and I'm gonna tin this with a little more solder than I would normally use. That way there's enough to flow and make that good connection. And you'll have a good mechanical bond and a nice good electrical connection. The important thing to do is to remember to not do is bridge these. You're gonna have to have space in between each one. You use too much solder, you get a little sloppy, and even one little strand, you know, bridging these. When you power it up, if you just bridge these accidentally, it probably won't ruin anything, and you can go back and fix it. It just won't work right. The servo just will go one way and freeze probably. So don't freak out if you make a mess. Really recommend having one of these things. It makes undoing mistakes really easy. So this is super hard to film because I got this camera in my face. I'm gonna set this down, prep everything, and film it, and hopefully you can see what I'm talking about. Maybe I've explained it well enough that you know what I'm gonna do here. Just be mindful that there are a couple little components over here that are surface mount. I'm sure it's super low temperature solder, so if you go too crazy with the heat over here, there's always a chance one of these could fall off. So just try to prep it all, get in and get out, and be done with it. So this is how I have it set up. It's all ready to solder. I've got it kind of pressing against, you know, the two pieces are kind of sprung against each other. So hopefully I can just add a little heat and make a nice joint. Not the prettiest thing, but it'll work. So this is what you're hopefully going to end up with. This is really hard for me to video this as I'm doing it. This last one didn't want to flow to the pad, so I added a little solder, ended up plopping it over. Had to end up, sucking it all back off, redoing these two. And then when I did, a lot of times when you're soldering to these little pads, if you don't get it just right the first time, it'll get all crusted up, and then you gotta heat it up with some fresh solder, suck it off, kind of clean it off a little bit, but that's what you want to end up with right there. No bridges, insulation up close enough, because what we're gonna do is we're gonna take these and bend them over like that. We're gonna tape them like that. So that's probably the most difficult part, is getting those soldered on. There is a way to cheat, and I'm gonna try to include a little piece of this stuff with the kit. What you want to do is get, I don't have it here with me, so wait, here it is, bus wire, really thin bus wire. This is actually basically the same stuff that the little component leads would have on a through-hole solder thing. I don't see any on here. But normally you would see a little lead, a little blob that's just your resistor, and then a lead. This is the same stuff. It's called bus wire. And you want some really thin stuff. And if you have a hard time soldering stranded wire like that to a board, you can take a little piece of that and heat the hole up and stick it in, and then just add a little bit of solder to make a good connection. And then you'll have leads, and you can actually spread them out and then solder your wires to that. But then you'll have to put some like heat shrink or some electrical tape or something over it to cover, so that they don't cross and short when you route this like that. So if you're still game for doing this, that's what it should look like. That's the biggest pain in the butt right there, getting that right. Everything else, well, the second pain in the butt is getting the hole in just the right spot and just the right shape, because you're putting a sort of a square peg into a round hole, because this is, you know, curved, and you've got to drill through it at just the right angle and everything. I'm going to show you a way that I think is going to be the easiest. Basically, we're just going to drill a pilot hole and then use a Lexan body reamer, and that go nice and slow. Once you get it all soldered up, this is basically how you're going to route it. Use electrical tape. And then it's going to kind of tuck down in here. Can't remember exactly how I do it in the end. I'm trying to figure it out as I do it. I think it's going to come down right there. That. And make sure you double check all these plugs as you're putting stuff back together. This time I had one pop out. It was that one right there. So just make sure you stick it back in. And also your antenna. We're gonna have to plug that back in. So make sure that's not covered up too much, and we can get that plug back in there. So once you get everything soldered up, make sure you plug your antenna back in. Just a piece of electrical tape to route it down this way. And it's gonna come down through the grip like this. I can't remember exactly where I route it. It goes along down through here, because you're gonna be soldering right back here somewhere. Right here for the new pot. And you're going to want to leave yourself some slack too when you solder it. That way, if you ever have to take it back apart, you know, and getting it back together, if you make it too short, it's going to be a real pain. But once you get everything looking nice, routed like that, make sure all your connectors are back together, your antenna is back together, and then you can go ahead and put the top plate back on. And for that, you'll have to look at the disassembly video, because I kind of showed where all these buttons are different, and they got little tabs on them. It's going to be really hard for me to like actually get a usable video of me putting it back on, because the way you do it is basically you put the buttons in the right spot here, kind of lay it like that. Then you put these buttons back in the right spot, and you kind of got to hold it and like that, and then put the screws back in. Otherwise the buttons will fall out as you're doing it. And this slots back in, that'll hold those buttons in. And then that can just kind of sit there while we're doing most of the rest of it. Alright. So, top plate is kind of back together. I haven't put the buttons in yet, because I'm probably gonna have this come out again, but it's okay. The only thing you need to remember about the wires really is what color the middle one is, because at this point I've got everything routed and everything. Before I start messing with the other stuff, I like to go ahead and test it. So I'm going to solder up a pot and just make sure my connections are good and I haven't overlooked anything. This is kind of how I ended up routing it. You can see this is the hole where this guy goes through. They all three tuck behind there pretty nicely. And that keeps it all routed. And you also want to check this and check this to make sure the wire's not interfering. It's pretty close right there, but with the tape it's not hitting. So double check that before you start putting everything back together. So I'm going to solder this up and make sure everything works. All right, so got the wires temporarily soldered up, everything hooked up here, and looks like we are a go. Double check the front steering, and we're good. So now it's just making the hole and finishing up. So once we're done with the soldering up here, I like to put buttons back in, these buttons back in, and you know, get all that done, and put a piece of tape. And then this board and these wires, pull them up out of the way and put a piece of tape on it. Keep it out of your way. That way when we're working here, we're not having stuff flopping around.